There we go.
And then can we have the presentation?
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You might have to ask if he's controlling the meeting.
Nathaniel, can you share your PowerPoint again?
Yes. Yeah. We just made a quick change. We'll bring it back up here momentarily.
Will we stand by for about 5 minutes or so?
Sure, like just a couple minutes.
Yeah, I'll walk down the hallway and
Okay. There we go. Beautiful.
Okay.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah. You're welcome. And you'll be where? I'll be right next door. All right. Awesome. Good. So, yeah, I think that should be it. Just come over and get me through any problems. Okay. Excellent.
All right, I will go ahead and introduce you. This is a class of about 44 students. You can't see them all, unfortunately, but
right.
Can you hear us pretty easily?
I can hear you guys great.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much for doing this. Let me introduce you, and then I'll let you take it away. So, class, this is my colleague, Professor Nathaniel Cogley, coming in from Tarleton State University. He's an expert in African politics and did fascinating work on ex-African rulers. So I will let him tell you more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning. I'm excited to do this via podcast or video cast. This came about, my job description here at Tarleton was someone with expertise in Africa or Asia. And then my first semester here, I taught African politics. And then this year, they assigned me Asian politics as well. So my Africa or Asia turned into Africa and Asia. And so I asked Dr. Devasher if she would guest lecture on India, and she accepted. And I'm reciprocating here for Africa. So I think this is actually a win-win, mutually beneficial situation. Happy to do it. So we talk about comparative politics, and what is comparative politics? Really, it's a methodology to try to understand why some things are different. You know, they could be at the country level, why this country is different from that country. It could also be at a region level, why this region is different than another region, or this city is different than another city. So African politics, you know, is a whole continent, and you can look at it in different ways in terms of its international relations or any type of political theory that comes out. So when we look at the comparative politics level of Africa, we're really trying to understand, you know, why we have some differences, and differences both within Africa and differences between Africa and other parts of the world. So this presentation just kind of covers some of the bigger questions that exist and some of the variation that we see in African politics. I don't mind questions as we go. So if there's, you know, something on the screen that someone wants clarification or has a follow-up with something that's, you know, we're talking about at that moment, this is certainly fine. This is enriches the lecture. So once again, thank you very much, and here we go. So the first type of thing we can look at is just looking at African states before we get into the government and the leader and all that stuff. We have different states, what Americans call countries, but what international relations call states. So these are, you know, the sovereign actors on the world stage, and African countries vary by their state design, and this has a lot of implication for the conditions of the country in many ways. So Africa had its own states before colonization took place. Different empires would emerge and exert control. So the idea of, you know, government, states in Africa, this certainly precedes European colonization. But colonization is going to be a big deal as they carve up the map in ways that Africa itself did not. So we have the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, and this is really, this is where in Berlin, a lot of the European powers who are preparing to colonize Africa meet together, and they come up with their rules for engagement of the process under which they will colonize Africa. You know, there's definitely an imperialistic thing here that Europe is going to colonize Africa, but it's also really an international relations accomplishment on the European level. This follows the colonization of the Americas, where the European powers fought each other a lot in the Americas. You have the French-Indian War and all these things going on in the Americas. As they're starting to colonize Africa, they come to certain terms of what the process of colonization will be, and what they're trying to avoid is conflict among themselves. So this is the conference where the rules for how they'll colonize Africa come about. It's largely successful, and they're able to avoid conflict amongst themselves. But at the end of the day, they're going to colonize the continent with the lone exception of Ethiopia. So this kind of charts out the process of colonization. You can see after the conference, it's still early on. The Europeans only have certain port areas, but they have a certain process in place for how they can claim different areas. As we go into 1910, you start to see each European power take its sphere. You have a big moment following World War I. We see Germany lose its colonies in Africa in World War I. And, you know, by the time we're hitting the 50s, you have basically this is the African map today. And so it comes from colonization. And there's a sense to the map. The sense is that this made sense based on what the European countries were accomplishing in terms of exploration, in terms of, you know, controlling different areas. So it made sense in terms of the European power play at the time. It also made sense in terms of, you know, colonies, in terms of extraction of resources, in terms of what would benefit the mother country. What this map doesn't really make sense is the idea of, you know, independent sovereign nation states. And of course, they had no conception that they were creating sovereign countries. They were creating colonies. That was the project of the day, and they weren't really didn't have the vision of they were creating sovereign countries. And so, being that the base of African countries are these colonies, you know, this creates some problem. And colonies not based on any reality on the ground in terms of African political development, but realities in terms of European conquering and colonization. So we reach independence and you get the Organization of African Unity, and one of the big clauses at when Africa reaches independence is the idea of respecting the colonial map. So this is a decision Africa makes on its own to keep the map that they inherited from colonialism. And, you know, this makes a lot of sense from their perspective. These leaders are emerging as leaders of these states that were former colonies, you know. So they're trying to protect what they've inherited, what they're the leader of. And so the Organization African Unity, one of the principles is respecting the colonial map that Africa inherited. So this is where the map comes from, and this is where the country designs come from, and there's some implications in terms of the condition of the countries. Yeah, so right here, you see my mouse?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
we do.
okay. So right here, yeah, respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of each state. And so this is one of the founding principles, Organization of African Unity. So we get this map which has a colonial birth, and it's still, you know, by and large the map of today. So this means a lot of the challenge in African independence has been the process of nation building. We learn in international relations, we learn the difference between a nation and a state. You know, a state is that sovereign political actor on the world stage. You know, the sovereign country, as Americans call them, a state, as international relations calls it, but it has sovereignty. It doesn't recognize higher authority. It is a political actor on the world stage. A nation is different. A nation is a group of people that believe they should govern themselves, whether or not they're actually doing so. And what we mean by the nation-state system is this idea that there should be some sort of overlap between nation and state, that the countries of the world should view themselves as a common people, common citizenship, you know, common future, that nation and state will overlap. What you got in Europe over European history is you got a lot of nations, people with a shared language, a shared culture, And through, thousands of years of warfare, they're able to establish certain states with certain borders, right? So in the European experience, the nation created the state. In Africa, we have the opposite. The state is inherited. The state is artificial. And a lot of the challenges of African independence is to create a nation out of their state. You understand? What was, natural in Africa were the thousands of ethnic groups that they have and the temporary empires that came from time to time. What is artificial is this idea of a commonality, I mean, what does it mean to be from a Togolese? There's no Togo language. What is Togo, To say, or in Nigeria, to say you're not Hausa, you're not Fulani, but you're Nigerian, whatever that means, But this idea of creating a common people with a common identity within Africa in a state that already existed. This has been one of the main challenges of independence. Different designs. So some countries, because the challenge of nation building is much more difficult in some countries than others. This is just a map of early civil wars that break out in Africa. And you can imagine the more difficult it is to create a nation of common people with a common identity, the more likely you are to have some sort of conflict amongst different groups of people within a state that have a different vision of the future. You might have multiple nations in a state that have multiple countries, and this can create a real problem. This is a more recent map of conflicts in Africa, but part of what I'm trying to highlight is a lot of these conflicts emerge in countries that have the most difficult challenge of nation building, where the state design is very complicated. And this is where we get a lot of these conflicts. So let's take a look inside some of these countries and see how some countries have a more easy state to manage, a state that lends itself to nation building better than another state that's very complicated, and nation building might be almost an impossible task sometimes. So one of the fault lines, and a major fault line in Africa, is religion. So Islam came very early. The Islamic expansion is in the 7th century, following Muhammad's death. It comes very early, and we see there's kind of two fault lines here. Islam extended down here in this parallel here, and also along the eastern Indian Ocean coast. Islam also extended. Christianity is brought in later by the European colonizers and also spreads a great deal. So you have these kind of two big fault lines of religion, one that goes right through West Africa and goes right through some of these West African countries, and then the other down the eastern Indian Ocean seaboard, which is a fault line through some of these Indian Ocean countries. So this fault line of people with different religions can create a lot of conflict within the country. Both types of religions would like to see one of their own as the president, one of their own in power. It can also really matter where the capital city is placed. Is the capital city placed in the Muslim area or in the Christian area? So you have this major fault line around religion. The more complex fault lines deal with African languages, African ethnicities. So this is looking at West Africa, and we see, just a multitude of languages within these countries, very complex language groups. And in West Africa, these are actually the smaller countries, right? So, very complex to try to make some nations out of these states, to get the Ivorians to say, we're Ivorian, we're not, from this ethnic group or that ethnic group, but we're Ivorian. This is a challenge, Here's Central and Southern Africa, and also a very complex mix of languages. The languages are established through some sort of African reality of, certain identities and ethnic groups and political conflict over the years. But the state is an artificial imposition on top of those naturally forming languages. So this right here is Nigeria. We see the Nigerian border around here, and you know Nigeria is Africa's most populated country, but it's always had a lot of trouble between the north and the south. So not only is there the fault line of religion where the north is Muslim and the south is predominantly Christian, but these are very different language groups. You see they're getting a different whole color subset. Hausa is the dominant language in the north. You have Yoruba in the west, Igbo in the east, and you have hundreds of other smaller languages. So Nigeria being so populated and having this major fault line between north and south and also east and west, very complicated state to build a nation out of, to get both northerners, southerners, westerners, easterners on board the idea that, you know, they're not Hausa, they're not Yoruba, they're not Igbo, but they're Nigerian. You know, this can be a real challenge. Here's Mali. If we look at the Mali border, I'm coming around here. As many of you know, Mali had a recent civil war, and of course the northern region has a totally different ethnic group, totally different language than the others. This is not a religious fault line because Mali is predominantly Muslim throughout, but this Tuareg region in the north has always rejected the idea that they're governed by people in the south of different ethnic group, different origin. So we've had a northern rebellion in the 70s, and we had northern rebellion in recent years that Mali itself was not able to put down. I mean, the French troops had to come back and stop the rebellion in the north. Mali itself would no longer exist as a state if it wasn't for French intervention over the last 2 years, right? So there's a real challenge of building a state out of Mali. This is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Oops. And you can see I'm going around the border here in black. You know, this is one of the most complex states in the world in terms of language and geography. You have Western people over here. You have jungle area. And then over here in the northeast, you have a totally different language group. Totally different language group. They don't understand each other. And a different population center. And so the Democratic Republic of Congo has always had this conflict between its two regions in the west, in the east, and also in the southeast. A very complex state to put together. So this is very difficult, what we call political geography, to make a nation out of this state that was inherited. And of course, this is Sudan, which is also very complicated, right? You get a Muslim, almost Arabic-speaking north, and you get this Christian, Nuer-speaking area in the south. And of course, we know that this led to a civil war. This is South Sudan is your one new state that isn't based on the colonial map. And well, I think we'll look at that. Now, that's in contrast to some other countries which have more simple political geography. So this is in southern Africa. Here's Swaziland. And you see, Swaziland is designed out of a traditional kingdom. So the British, when they came upon this area, there was a kingdom that was already in place with a language group already in place. And so, you know, Swaziland inherits the Swazi kingdom that predated colonialism, and 90% of the people speak the Swazi language. You know, it's much more easy. It's also smaller. You know, it's much more easy to make a country out of this, to make a country where everyone feels like they're part of the same political community. Same thing with Lesotho here, you know, predominantly it's one group, and the kingdom was recognized, and they made a state out of the kingdom. All right, so this leads to some actors, some academics who have kind of focused on state design, and this is Jeffrey Herbst. This book is used a lot in comparative politics classes. So he writes, those countries with either very large territories and or difficult population distributions find it exceptionally hard to consolidate authority. And he kind of has this chain of logic. Difficult political geography leads to an inability to broadcast authority, a dysfunctional state, and this can lead to economic stagnation. Obviously, dysfunctional state also leads to civil wars and chaos and killing and, you know, all these things. These are some maps that he offers in his book. You see something like Senegal here is very difficult. This is, the Gambia is in the middle of Senegal, and So Senegal has a north and a south, and the capital is up here in the north, dominated by Wolof-speaking people. And of course, Senegal is a wonderful country. You can visit and go to the beach, and very friendly culture. But it also has a southern region that's been in civil war for many decades. This is Casamance. Also nice beaches, but it has a rebellion that's never ended. And you can see this kind of geography of having a north that's basically split from the south, where the capital's in the north, and the southerners are bitter over the fact that they're controlled by a group of people on the other side of the Gambia, has led to a very difficult political geography, right? Here you get Angola. Angola is actually two pieces. You have the main part of Angola here, but you actually have this other piece called Cabinda, which is physically separated from the main part of Angola. You have to go through the DRC in order to get to Cabinda. So it's no wonder that Cabinda's had a civil war for many decades now. The DRC, you get the kind of, not just languages, but the concentration of population, a heavily populated west, a heavily populated northeast, and both groups of people fight for control of the country. Oftentimes, at least to the degree that they've had elections recently, it's been, a Westerner versus an Easterner. And you can imagine the Easterner gets 90% of the vote in the East, and the Westerner gets 90% of the vote in the West. And there's accusations of fraud at the end, and both sides feel they legitimately won. And, it's a very difficult political geography. So Herbst, in his book, he kind of classifies countries as having, different types of political geographies, whether they're difficult or they're favorable or they're neutral. I might disagree with some of his classifications, but the main point is not all African states have the same challenge when it comes to nation building. Some of them have very difficult challenges in nation building. Some of them are much more easy to manage and govern than others. Pierre Engelbert also looked at that. The developmental capacity of African states is partly a function of their degree of legitimacy and congruence with pre-colonial institutions. This kind of goes in line with Swaziland and Lesotho and Botswana we were looking at earlier. So state illegitimacy would lead to neo-patrimonial tendencies and corruption, poor governance, and economic stagnation. So, one of the questions you look at in African politics is the degree to which, there needs to be some major changes to the map. And of course, both of these authors argue that point. Engelbert says, my results deliver indeed a strong indictment of the policy of African heads of state and of the United Nations to maintain African states within their colonial borders after independence. Herbst writes, the first step toward developing new alternatives would be to provide the intellectual space necessary for Africans to present alternatives by stating that the international community is not blindly wedded to the current state system. Just the idea of allowing the map to change, not be stuck with the colonial map. Now, that's these Western academics. A lot of Africans are born in their nation state, and it's also a question of stability. Some people disagree. So here's Professor Gottlieb. He's saying the idea of redrawing the African map would cause anarchy and disorder on a planetary scale. Economist magazine, stupid as they may be, but trying to redraw them could plunge the continent into chaos. So that map is problematic. But what alternative map are you going to? Who's going to draw it? And you can imagine if there was actually the space to redraw the map, there's going to be a lot of fighting and disagreeing about what the new map should look like, and so kind of inviting this opportunity to not be stuck with the colonial map, redraw the map. It could bring about a level of chaos as, Europe spent thousands of years fighting over their map, do we want to spend the next century fighting over the African map, or should we just accept what's already in place? Now, we do have a new country, right? So we do have South Sudan, but this comes at a cost. South Sudan, born in 2011, but it wasn't easily attained. It is born through war, 38 years of civil war, 2.5 million people killed, 5 million displaced. That gets you a referendum. gets you independence, and then it gets you a border war with North. I mean, North Sudan, South Sudan have disputed the border. Also, South Sudan isn't necessarily a functioning state. It's currently itself in civil war right now. So there is potential to change, but it doesn't come easily. It doesn't come peacefully. A lot of states are born through warfare. So now we have a different type of question here. This is not looking at the actual shape of the country, the shape of the state, but the type of regime that exists within the state. This is a map I made. Madhvi, you might remember this. No, you were 1 year behind me, right? Yeah. So yeah, I made this in some of my research. So I was looking at the level of democracy in different African countries, both during the Cold War and after the Cold War. So purple is very negative. This would mean a very dictatorial regime. You know, no elections or free press or things of that sort. Bright orange means we have a high level of democracy according to this agency, Polity 4, which kind of tries to measure, quantify how democratic countries are. So we can see following African independence, even up till 1990, Africa is largely a continent of dictators, very little democracy on the continent. And the actual exceptions here are kind of interesting because they're not truly exceptions. You had the Gambia, which is democratic at the time, and you have Botswana. But what makes these countries very interesting is they are holding elections routinely. Those elections are viewed as free and fair, but it's the same party that's always winning the elections. The incumbent government party never loses the election, right? So it's easy to have elections when you know you're going to be the winner, right? Once you think you might be the loser, you might shut off the democratic process, right? And you have the birth of South Africa. South Africa here is, of course, apartheid South Africa. So it's doing elections, opposition wins, but it's only enfranchising a small fraction of the population. So the democratic record in Africa up until the 90s was dismal, really. We have the end of the Cold War, and we see that things change in some places. You see that Africa kind of develops its own regional identities here. Democracy is able to emerge in West Africa sometimes. You see some of it's democratic, some of it's not. And also Southern and Eastern Africa, you get some levels of democracy in Southern Eastern, but you got two regions that really have resisted democratization even after the Cold War period. So North Africa, which is very much culturally considered part of the Middle East, Arabic-speaking countries. So North Africa has resisted democratization, and also Southern Africa has really remained a region of dictators even after the Cold War has ended. So what's the Cold War story? How is this affecting Africa? You know, Cold War being kind of East versus West, and Africa is really kind of a battleground. Different African states, some support the East, the Soviet Union, some support the USA, and they basically become client states. If they support the Soviet Union or the USA, they get a lot of funding. And so Africa is really a battleground for client states in order to support the USA or the Soviet Union in the UN, in order to allow the Soviet Union or the USA to have military bases. You know, it's a battlefront in the Cold War. You know, USA likes to export democracy, but not always. You know, during the Cold War, the priority was outmaneuvering the Soviets. And so here we see a series of US presidents all making pals with Mobutu. And he's the leader of what was called Zaire, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You see him with Kennedy and Reagan and Nixon and Bush. And this guy's not democratic in any stretch of the imagination. In fact, he's a big dictator, a big thief. You know, he dies with billions of dollars in his Swiss bank account. But he's a friend of the U.S. because he was a strategic partner. So he received a lot of funding and support. So this is Professor Dr. Devasher and I had at Yale. I think he's at Stanford now, right?
At Berkeley.
Oh, he's at Berkeley. Okay, I got it wrong. Yeah, so he writes this in 2004, talking about the impact of the Cold War and how the end of the Cold War made pressuring African countries for democracy more viable. So he writes, when two opposing and competing donors such as the Soviet Union and the West vie for influence and clients, aid-receiving countries enjoy greater leverage vis-a-vis their foreign patrons. To the extent that donors actually prefer to promote democracy among recipient countries, threats to make aid conditional on the fulfillment of democratic reforms may not be credible, because withholding aid from autocratic countries could mean losing clients to other Cold War powers. Basically, if the U.S. tried to force their dictators to have elections, those dictators would just say, forget you, I'm going to go with the Soviets, right? So the U.S. was not in a position to pressure democracy at that time. African leaders, with the end of the Cold War, African leaders lost significant leverage with which to resist aid conditionality because only one donor offered aid to them in the post-Cold War period. No longer able to take refuge in balance of power politics, recalcitrant African states could be more effectively pressed to undertake the democratizing reforms that Western donors had de-emphasized during the Cold War. All right, so there's kind of one explanation of the African story in terms of democratization is the Cold War. This is an article by Jensen and Wanchikon, and it looks at resource wealth to the degree that some countries have high oil reserves, some countries have natural resources. It's a similar way to think about it. You know, foreign aid would help a lot of these dictators resist democratic pressure because that money helps them stay in power. To the degree that they'll lose money if they're not democratic, it would be harder for them to stay in power. So the story with foreign aid is money. It's a money story. And also, to the degree that some of these regimes have an independent source of money, they have oil reserves or what have you, these oil reserves can also help them resist foreign pressure for democratization. These oil reserves can also help them buy out political opponents in the country and resist pressures for democratization within their countries. You know, it's this old line, money is power, right? So to the degree that some of African regimes have independent source of wealth, also allows them to resist, you know, pressures for change or democratization or opposition victory or what have you. So this is, I don't know if you guys have done stats, maybe. New Hampshire's a good school, right? So
Some of them have taken stats courses.
I mean, New Hampshire's one of the best universities in the country. Am I right or wrong?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I hear. Yeah, so I'm sure you guys know your way around a regression model, but basically this is a regression model out of that article. And we just see that resource dependence, you know, the fact that some of these countries have a lot of resource wealth decreases their level of democracy. And that's statistically significant across all their models, right? So the degree that these countries have oil or diamond reserves or whatever, some natural resource they can use as an independent source of wealth, allows them to resist changes for democratization. So now we look at not the type of regime, but the transitions between regimes. And of course, it's not the same thing. Everyone knows that China is not democratic by any stretch of the imagination, but China does have term limits. I mean, their leaders have a regular turnover. They can't stay forever. The term limits is fixed. You could also have a democratic country where the same guy wins over and over and over and over. And, you know, so this is just looking at the length of the regime and the type of transition that takes place. And so I gave you guys an article. I think you guys must have read this one. And this is talking about how African politics has changed over time, that in the early independence years, Africa was characterized as a continent of personal rule. And what that meant was that ultimate authority was put into a person. It was put into the president, that was the authority. As compared to what? I mean, another source of authority is a constitution, the rules, that the president can't do anything he wants, that he's limited by the constitution, or he's limited by the public voting, or that something limits him in his decision making. And so much of African independence is this idea that ultimate authority rests in a single person, and that person can disregard the Constitution, disregard majority rule. You know, if the president tells you to go against the Constitution, what's your loyalty? Is your loyalty to what the president tells you to do, or what the Constitution tells you not to do, or, you know, right? So in the African experience, many of these countries were characterized as personal rule. The Constitution was merely a tool for the president to use or ignore as he saw fit, right? And so what this article is highlighting is the degree to which institutions and political institutions, government institutions, are starting to have more weight in Africa. Constitutions are starting to matter more. This article focuses on term limits, the degree to which term limits are more effective than they used to be. The need for elections is stronger, right? And so they look at the type of exits that have taken place. And so back here, Cold War period, most African transitions or exits happen through coups or assassinations. This was the natural way of regimes leaving office. And in the more recent years, we've seen more institutional ways of Africans leaving. So natural death, which is, you know, neither institutional or not, even dictators die, but, you know, voluntary resignations from office or losing an election, or they should even add term limits in there, right? This is more and more the way the African leaders are leaving, is through an institutionally recognized process rather than through an extra constitutional process of coups or overthrows. They chart this out for you, and they look at different types of situations with term limits. One, does the Constitution have a term limit or not? Has that term limit been reached? If it has been reached, was there an attempt to amend the Constitution? Yes or no? And was that attempt successful? Yes or no, right? So basically highlighting that the institutions matter more. They talk about the Nigerian case and suggest Obasanjo wanted to stay, but the institutions and the presidential term limit forced him out, and that some African leaders are forced out. Their story is a story of institutions, rules, and limits. So here they write on page 137, we are making broad claims and should offer a few cautions and clarifications. First, we are not saying that African leaders today have any less desire to stay in power than their predecessors did. Our claim is simply that leaders today are more constrained by formal rules in trying to achieve their most preferred outcomes. They accept electoral defeats when they might prefer to stay in office. Many of them, roughly half, stand down in the face of two-term limits when they would prefer to run for a third term. Or they change the rules so that their preferred outcome no longer violates those rules, in which case the impact of the rules is felt not in the outcome that is reached, but in the way it is achieved. So it's a story of the rules mattering more, the constitutions mattering more, and these kind of electoral processes mattering more. So this leads to kind of my work, because I don't disagree with them. I fully agree what they're saying. The rules matter more, Constitution matters more. The electoral process matters more, but there's this other side. I mean, not every leader is forced out. There's also variation into the degree to which leaders want to stay in power. The desire to stay is different than the ability to stay. So their article is very much focused on the ability, to say African leaders are not as able to stay forever now as they were before. My research is looking more at that desire to stay. And as Americans, we're familiar with the example of George Washington. You know, I mean, George Washington serves 2 terms. He can run for a third. He can win a third. He voluntarily chooses not to do it. You know, not all African leaders force their way in. And so I'm trying to explain these voluntary resignations from power, when leaders leave power and they don't necessarily have to. And I'm also suggesting in my work that in the modern era, it's not as attractive to stay forever. You know, the norms have changed, the expectations have changed in the modern era, that modern African presidents are not in the same mindset as former African presidents. It's a different political culture that they live in. It's a different audience that they play to, right? So I was able to interview a number of presidents and former presidents, and I got some pictures and some quotes from them I'll share with you. But this is a table of African leaders who have exited office by a retiring midterm or not even seeking re-election. So these are very clear cases of leaders who can stay longer and choose not to. Senghor in Senegal, 1980 is your first case. You know, he's been there 20 years and he decides to give up power to his prime minister, Abdou Diouf, in the middle of his term. And we got a number of cases here. The interview I was able to get is this guy in Botswana, Kwet Masere. He left after 18 years in power, and it's a similar story. He retired in the middle of his term, and there weren't protests in the streets. There wasn't a rebellion. He was not forced out. This was his choice to leave after 18 years in office. So I did an interview with him for dissertation research. This is at his house in Botswana. And so this is one explanation he gives for why he decided to retire after 18 years. He says, "I think I decided to retire the day I was sworn in as the president. Here's one thing again that was happening, which was giving Africa a bad name. That ones there would never want to leave, and I was going to prove that wrong because I was going to retire as soon as I thought the time to retire had come." So, I mean, this quote kind of highlights the degree to which this is kind of a conscious decision. This is kind of a political strategy. He phrases it in the terms of, it would be good for Africa's reputation. But that's true, but it's also good for his reputation. I mean, this guy is well regarded. He's regarded as one of Africa's greatest presidents. He's, you know, he's in good standing in the world. He's in good standing in history. And so, you know, doing 18 years and then leaving voluntarily is not bad for him. Now, it's a question of what are these guys after, you know? The assumption in political science is that they're after power. Well, if you're after power, then giving up power doesn't make sense, right? But if you're after kind of a great legacy, you know, people looking at you in positive ways, and then this does make sense, right? This makes sense if you change what they're trying to accomplish. Different types of exits. You get some African leaders who leave because of term limits. So this is a list of some leaders that left during term limits. Now, I would agree with Posner and Young that some of these people are forced out. So some of these term limits are strong, and it can be difficult for a president to remove the term limits. And we experience that now in the US. You know, we have the 22nd Amendment, which gives term limits. And so whether Clinton, Bush, or Obama wanted to leave or not, they didn't really have much of a choice because the 22nd Amendment is pretty hard to remove. And Americans wouldn't stand for them changing the Constitution and staying. So that story is true in some of these. Some of these were certainly forced out. But I also know there's variation in the degree to which some of these people even try. You know, some of them really try to change the term limits. They make the attempt to do so. Some are successful. Some remove term limits in those attempts, right? So if they're after power, we would expect them all to try, give it their best effort. Some of them would succeed in removing term limits and staying. We do see some of them try and fail, but we also see some that never try. You know, they're just, here comes the term limit. They do it with a smile. They do it with absolutely zero attempt to change the Constitution. So the interview I'll share with you here is John Kufuor in Ghana. Ghana only has 4-year terms, so he serves 8 years like an American president. His predecessor had served, you know, I forget, Jerry Rawlings served 26, 27 years. I mean, he served a long time in office, and Kufuor was limited to 8 years. Kufuor also had, his party controlled the parliament, so they had a lot of political strength at the time. I mean, to the degree that Kufuor wanted to make a strong attempt to change the Constitution and remove those term limits, he would have had a good shot. But Kufuor doesn't try. So here's I did an interview with Kufuor, and he tries to explain why he didn't even try to change the term limits that he faced. So He says, I never contemplated staying in office even a day beyond the constitutionally fixed term. Part of the reason I came into politics to try to ingrain a sense of constitutionality in the system. And so when I got the opportunity through the operation of the Constitution to become president, there was no way I would think of violating the very Constitution I had sworn to uphold and defend just so I could continue for a day longer. It was the end of my second tenure. I was looking forward to stepping down. My concern really was to be able to step down honorably, because I knew, again, talking of history, that I would be the first civilian leader to be stepping down, to be completing my term constitutionally. The three earlier ones had all been overthrown by soldiers, even way before the end of their tenure. So I was very, very determined that I would stay the course of the Constitution and constitutionally step down. So achieving that to me was even historic. And so it never occurred to me to want to cut corners or manipulate the Constitution so I would continue. I know other people have tried, but they haven't impressed me at all. So you can see Kufuor is, and it's not just his words, it's his actions too. I mean, he's not just focused on power, power, power. I mean, if that was his goal, he'd give it a shot. He'd give changing the Constitution, removing term limits a shot, because many African presidents have been successful in doing that. But here his concern, and his actions give it credibility. His concern is his place in history, being known as someone who respects the Constitution, constitutional process, And if we just think about Kufuor's place in history, this makes sense. I mean, he's looked at honorably, his exit is honorable, and it's like our Washington thing. Washington is viewed as in a great way for what he did, voluntarily stepping down. And some African presidents have the ability to play that role in their country. And so Kufuor's behavior makes sense when we change what we think about what he's trying to accomplish. Different type of exit here. African heads of state who have exited office via losing an election. So you have elections, all these guys want to win or they wouldn't be running. And to some degree, some of these people are forced out because they're doing everything they can. Opposition wins, and they just can't stay. The election goes against them. They're forced out. I think there's a recent case of this in the Gambia that hit the news, and some people may have followed. But Yahya Jammeh was removed. He lost an election, and then after he lost the election, he still tried everything he could to change the results, to play games with the Constitution, to try to get a revote, and of course he failed. The fact of losing an election actually forced him out. But not all of these leaders put up the same level of resistance. First of all, some leaders can annul elections, can schedule revotes and get away with it. Some of these leaders don't even try. They accept the results. There's also the degree to which they allow themselves to lose. I mean, some of them are able to appoint the electoral commissioner. And if they really wanted to rig the system, they could. They put in their buddy and the buddy rigs it for them. To the degree that some of these put in an actual independent commissioner, they allow an actual independent vote to take place, they respect the results when they don't go in their favor. There is some degree of desire here, not just ability. So I interviewed Abdou Diouf. You can see he's on this list. There he is, Abdou Diouf. In 2000, he loses an election, and he set up the Independent Electoral Commission. He immediately called the opponent on the phone and congratulated him. He did nothing to resist these results. And he was very powerful at the time. Senegal had never experienced an opposition victory before, so this was new and unexpected. Everyone assumed he'd be guaranteed victory. So he explains his accepting of these results in this way. The Constitution of Senegal permitted the President of the Republic to seek another mandate, and all the comrades of my party, all the counsel that I was given, they wanted me to continue. So I accepted to continue. After a lot of reflection, of course, but I accepted to continue. And I don't regret it. I organized perfect elections. Everything was done transparently. I nominated a minister of the Interior that was not from my party, who was a former general in the military. I put him there. I made sure that all the institutions that were going to be involved in the elections were not controlled by my party or another party, so that we could achieve an absolute neutrality. The elections were held under the best conditions. I did not win. I didn't appeal. I did not even wait for the results to be officially announced. I said, Mr. Wad won. I telephoned him to congratulate him. I made a statement to the country and I left. We did a beautiful transition of power. And I'm sure that Senegal won a much greater credibility by this defeat and an extraordinary example that was given to the world and to Africa. And so he's highlighting the fact that he could have done some things that he didn't do. He allowed this independent election to take place. He respected the results. We don't see all African leaders do that. And when it comes to the reward, he puts it in terms of how this is good for Senegal and this is good for Africa. And of course, I would agree. I would just also add that it's also good for him. I mean, Abdou Diouf is looked upon honorably as well. The fact that he left peacefully, the fact that he respected the election, he has a very good reputation in Senegal and around the world. So it depends what these guys are trying to get, what they're after. If they're after power, this doesn't make sense. If they're after their place in history, their glory, their reputation, this makes sense. And then finally, you get some military coups throughout African history, and there's variation in what comes next. Some of these guys choose to try to stay forever. You know, the military leader tries to force themselves to be president for the next 20 years, but this doesn't always happen. So these are military leaders who exit office after an interim role. So they take power through a coup, but then they don't try to stay. They don't try to stay beyond the transition point where elections are held. You know, some of these military leaders, they say, don't worry, I'm going to leave, we'll hold elections. But then when the election comes, they present themselves as a candidate. You know, they're the candidate, and of course they rigged the system in their favor. This was definitely the Yahya Jammeh story in the Gambia that recently hit the news, right? So here we have some military coup leaders who did not try to stay, who respected the idea that they were there temporary, that they would hold an election, that they would respect the results of the election, that they wouldn't be a candidate in the election. And so I got an interview with, where is he? Touré. Right here, Amadou Toumani Touré. His first tenure, he was a two-time president. So his first tenure came from a military coup. His later tenure came from winning the election. But that was not a direct transition. There was a president in between those two tenures. So I interviewed him as he was president in the presidential palace during his second presidency. So we're talking about the first presidency here. He said, as a Malian, I pride myself in keeping my word. We have a saying, the word gives. And I had said before the whole world on the day of the coup that as soon as conditions were met and as quickly as possible, I give it a year, we would be leaving power. So this was my clear message. This was the first message I broadcasted on Malian television. Given that my education in my village is a community-based education where the words that you speak are important, if I had not kept my word, if I had lied, I could not even go see my parents because they would not understand that in the education that they gave me that I did not respect my own word. Also, I was not prepared. I was a lieutenant colonel. I commanded a regiment of paratroopers. I was not familiar with politics. I did not know how to do that. I had military responsibility. That I understood. Therefore, I was not inclined to do it. On the other hand, there were also people who had sacrificed a lot, people who were beaten or killed to oust the former regime, and I felt I would be an usurper if I came in, picked up this victory as if it was my own. Therefore, I decided to organize free and transparent elections. So again, this guy's talking about, you know, his reputation, how that would be viewed by his community if he had gone against his word and tried to force himself in office. It's a bit over dramatic. He's suggesting he couldn't go see his parents, and I bet he could because he would have been president. I'm sure he could have seen his parents, but you know, the big point is it would have hurt his reputation. It's not the reputation that he wanted. Yeah. So, you know, this type of research kind of leads me, this is some points from an article that I'm working on, you know. So I make these type of points that political power is a means, not an end. Yeah, I mean, in political science, we assume that political power is the goal. And I'm suggesting it's a means towards other ends, okay? And there's could be a lot of goals like life and health and all these other things that humans value. There's only 3 goals that can explain a voluntary entry and a voluntary exit. That can explain both the entry and the exit. Of course, if not everyone wants political power, and if you don't want power, you might never be president. So we need a motive that encourages people to want to be president at one point in time and makes them not want to be president at another point in time. So one, money can do it. Being president can really lift you up in terms of making money. And usually presidents are very rich and all these things, but you can imagine a situation where there can be a lot of money for leaving. I don't know how much the Clintons have made since they were in the presidency, right? They made a lot of money. Bill Clinton gets speaking fees. I think Obama just got $60 million book deal, So anyway, there's some variables here, right? To the degree that the post-presidency offers you a lot of money-making opportunities, that might encourage you to step down. And also to the degree that corruption is limited, If a president can be corrupt, well, being president can make you very rich. But if opportunities for corruption are very limited and the rewards of being a former president are very big, like in the US, money itself might explain that story of voluntarily entering one day, voluntarily exiting another. You also have this idea, and I don't discount it, even though a lot of political science too, but the idea of just affecting public policy. I mean, you may be the best person for the job at one point in time. You're the great leader with the great ideas and the charisma and all that. But, as you get older, as you've been there longer, you may recognize you're no longer the best person to bring about the type of change that you and your supporters would like. So that also can explain entry or exit. This is interesting because this is a motive that politicians claim. If you ask them why are they motivated for politics, they always say it's this one. They're trying to affect the public good. They're trying to help their community, help the children, But I don't discount it. I mean, it could explain an entry or exit. And just to the degree that some people in politics are more honorable and more, interested in the public good than others, we certainly see variation in the types of characters that become presidents. This is the one I really run with in my work, is this idea of social esteem. Just power can make you an important, great person, make you part of history, make you the number one person on the news, make you the thing that everyone talks about, top of the hierarchy. So there's definitely a reason, if you're trying to maximize social esteem, there's definitely a reason to become president. You're the top of the hierarchy. You're the first story in the news. Now, what I identify in some of these interviews and some of this research is there's also potentially social esteem reasons for leaving office. Washington is viewed in great ways for leaving. Some of the presidents I just showed you interviews with, their reputation was increased by them leaving. So there's some things that could be in place that can actually play on this motive of social esteem and encourage presidents to leave office, just in terms of what they're after, if it's social esteem. So some things you can do to try to make that social esteem encourage voluntary departures, peaceful transitions. You can lower the contemporary importance of current heads of government. So like through checks and balances, make them, less important, although they're still top. Or you can raise the contemporary importance of former heads of government. You can give them prominent positions, prominent posts, special envoys of the UN. I know Abdou Diouf is president of La Francophonie, the community of French-speaking states. The degree to which a former president is going to view their post-presidency as an honorable position that gets respect, will make them more comfortable going into that lifestyle, rather than in some countries, post-presidents are, exiled. Post-presidents are arrested because they're a potential political threat. There's different ways that we treat former presidents, and the degree to which we give former presidents respect and honor and money to go around and do these things, that actually makes the post-presidency more attractive than it would be otherwise. We can also lower the ability of heads of government to control contemporary admiration via propaganda and silencing contemporary criticism. So the degree to which they're wanting everybody to think of how great they are, in countries without free press, the president controls that narrative. The fact that they silence dissenting voices, the fact that they control the state media, And of course, the state media says how wonderful they are. And I don't know if some of you have traveled through some of these dictatorships, but it can be effective. The propaganda can be effective. So the degree to which they're able to control this narrative in the country about their presidency and the type of stuff they're doing, right, the more they might be encouraged to stay around, because they're also able to control the narrative of them staying around. But the degree to which they lose that, they might actually have to, step down in order to have an honorable exit. And then there's basic societal changes, massive societal changes that take place over time. The old saying was, long live the king. And people meant it, the king brought stability. Who watches Game of Thrones over there in New Hampshire? We got some Game of Thrones watchers?
No one, no Game.
HBO, Game of Thrones?
One fan so far.
One fan, okay. Westeros is in turmoil as people kill each other and armies marches and people fight over the throne, right? To the degree that a stable kingdom, a king who is on the throne, bringing stability, long live the king. And there's value in long live the king. There's stability, there's peace, right? And to the degree that we've lost this kind of notion, and there's more of a societal expectation that you serve your time and you leave peacefully, that can encourage presidents to want to do so, because they're, it's like a play. They're playing to an audience. There's an audience out there, and they want the audience to applaud, and they want the audience to give them good reviews. And to the degree that the audience is going to reward, stepping down after a certain amount of time, makes them more likely to want to step down after a certain amount of time. So that's kind of my take on the regime transitions and some of the work that we're looking at. I had something else that is different subject, but I don't know. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have about 15 minutes. So it'd be great if people have questions. This would be a good time to ask them, or?
Yeah, let's do it. So I'll skip this one and we'll go to this one. Lots of fun. Thank you, New Hampshire. So if we have any questions, I'd love to take them.
Yeah. All right. Questions. It's a lot of information. Okay. Right there.
So that's how we do it in Texas. In Texas, we do it big. We do everything big. So.
Okay, I'm going to try to point you. I'm going to point the screen at the student if I can, or not. Go ahead. Yeah, come up and so you can see who's asking him a question.
Oh, this is fun. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, hello, sir. How are you?
Okay. What do you think is the greatest motivator for a leader to step down?
The greatest motivator? Well, my research focuses on that social esteem, Power is helpful towards their greatness. A lot of these leaders, they want to be great. I look in my dissertation, I actually used some surveys of students, kids, that's done in Ghana, and kids don't hide their ambition. Kids say, yeah, they're going to be president and everyone will think how great they are and they're going to be so famous and all this kind of stuff. Now, later in life, you learn that's bad politics. If you're a politician, you never admit to that. You never admit that you want to be great, that you want people to recognize you as great and important. Politicians always phrase it in terms of helping the people, It's a sacrifice. What they want to do is help the people. But, the presidency, the head of government, this is a big deal. And this puts you in history. And this creates a lot of people who admire your accomplishments, your works. And I would say it's not a motive just for politics, look at Hollywood and look at music and, some people achieve this great social esteem through another path, but in politics too, one of the motivators of humanity is kind of the audience that we play to and the degree to which others hold us in high regards, in both high regards and also in positive terms. So that's the motive that I focus on, because I think it's underrepresented, it's under talked about. I also think money moves people, but that's already out there. The whole discipline of economics is focused on that. So I'm not offering too much to that line of thinking, but to the degree that social esteem really motivates these people, and we can understand some of their behavior based on social esteem. I'm trying to highlight that in this work that I'm sharing.
Great.
Good question. Be sure to give him participation points.
I will, or points on his midterm. We'll see. Okay, Madison's gonna kind of speak to you from there. Can you see? Yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
There you are. She's there.
Hi. In your opinion, what do you think Africa is going to look like, or it's like the countries in Africa in the next 50 years on terms of demographic?
Okay, so we're talking about the future. How many years did you give me?
50.
15?
50.
50. So what are we? 2067. So that's a long ways away. What's really interesting, we're having this kind of talk right now about globalism versus nationalism. And I remember teaching as a grad student with Dr. Devasher there. I remember international relations class. The professor is great, and he was expert on Europe. And when he came across the European Union, the story was why it's so successful, why this new supranational organization is so successful, and Europe is headed towards continental unity. And it was really a success story of kind of leaving behind the old nation state and forming a new continental union. And of course, we see now that the European Union has big problems. And Britain exited. There's a lot of problems with the EU currency, the euro, and one state not wanting to fund others, deficits. And there's a lot of breakup, and there's kind of this pull back towards nation state. So the same thing, we can look at Africa to the degree that they also have the African Union. And the African Union has the same ambitions of the European Union, but less further along. But the idea is a continental political union, a continental parliament, a continental court system, a continental foreign policy, a lot of ambition there. And, I would say 2067, they will still not have reached it, yeah? You'll still be dealing with the nation states of Africa today. All right, so the continental ambition will not be reached. Presidents don't like to demote themselves to the rank of governor. To the degree that you have 54 presidents, if you had a continental union, you get one president, 53 get demotion, one gets promotion. So I don't really see that taking place. I do think the DRC is really not very functional. I don't know to what degree the Democratic Republic of the Congo will still exist in 50 years. But other than that, you probably will keep the same map. You'll probably see more levels of democratization, slow and steady, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And you'll see economic development. You'll see less war. I think you'll see positive changes in Africa over the next 50 years. In terms of democracy and development, but you won't see an end to the nation state, and you won't see much changes in the map. Maybe DRC will fight another civil war, and maybe half of it will break off. But that's my best prediction, But the future is hard to predict. But good question.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, right here. Can you see next to Madison?
Hi.
Hi.
So going back to the way the states are set up in Africa, why do you think that the populations that share common language and beliefs don't move towards other populations that have the same language and beliefs and kind of form their states based off of the language and beliefs that they share versus staying in a state that's so diverse and has so much disconnect almost?
Are you suggesting that people immigrate to another state where their ethnic group is dominant, or are you suggesting a changing of the borders to fit the language patterns that exist?
I guess immigrate, yeah. So just completely moving.
Yeah, I mean, you do get a lot of immigration in Africa. You do have refugees all over the place. It does take place, but it's very rare to find a country with, a country like Swaziland or Lesotho or Botswana, right? You're going from one state of mixed languages and ethnicity to another, so you do see a lot of immigration. A lot of this is caused by civil war and discord and refugees fleeing conflicts. A lot of it is also called economically. You get some countries that are economically more successful than others, so people will come for the job opportunities. We're familiar with that here in the U.S., economic immigration. So that happens. Some interesting case would be Somalia. I mean, Somalia, the Somali people and the Somali language are much bigger than Somalia. And so you did have the Somali government actively fight wars against its neighbors to try to claim the territory of Somali-speaking people in Ethiopia, Somali-speaking people in Kenya, and that's called irredentism. That's called trying to grow the state to encompass the people who speak the common language of that state, right? And so this happened in the build-up World War II. Hitler's first moves were taking over German-speaking people in other neighboring countries, right? And so the Somali experiment with expanding their borders to include Somali-speaking people in neighboring countries was, of course, war. Kenya and Ethiopia did not accept the fact that they were going to lose territory, and they fought wars, and we saw Somalia in chaos for the last couple of decades because it became a very militaristic society. So we do see refugees, but a lot of these states have these problems and mix. I think it's more economic and refuge type immigration, but it happens.
Well, thank you very much, Nathaniel. Thank you for joining us from Texas. I think we all appreciate it. Can we just give a kind of
Thank you very much, New Hampshire. I really appreciate it. And I feel like I'm in a primary and going to get a lot of votes, so I'm happy.
Well,
and Dr. Devasher, we look forward to your presentation on India in my Asian politics class. So that's going to be.
I look forward to it as well. Thank you so much.
Talk soon. Thanks, guys.
I'll be bye.